This video will contain spoilers for the live-action Lilo and Stitch remake. Lilo and Stitch is going absolute gangbusters right now, opening to over $180 million domestically and over $340 million worldwide. Its record-shattering performance should only serve to answer any questions you may have about Disney's intention, or the industry's plans more broadly even, to continue pumping out these live-action remakes. The unfortunate thing is, though, that these movies are capable of finding this level of success while being generally regarded as anywhere from just okay to an indelible atrocity, without ever eclipsing the good old good movie 7 out of 10 threshold. However, it seems as though Lilo and Stitch is actually bucking that trend, with largely positive critic and audience sentiment, and clearly great commercial success to go with it. After seeing the movie for myself, I could not disagree more. I've sat on it for a couple days now, and I've actually come to the realization that Lilo and Stitch can serve as the cornerstone example of the fact that live-action remakes eclipsing their original animation is a literal impossibility. The story is uniquely positioned to be a very clear and digestible case study of why live-action remakes are fundamentally cursed to live in the shadow of what spawned them. In the past, I've found myself constantly wondering if one day one of these remakes would come out and genuinely surprise me. Will one of these things ever be truly worth its salt? And my answer to that is a confident no. 2025's Lilo and Stitch serves to show us why live-action remakes simply cannot work and cannot ever surpass tepid mediocrity. What is the goal of a remake? Or rather, what should be the goal of a remake? For the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to omit the admittedly legitimate and obvious answer of to make a lot of money on a pretty safe bet answer. To answer this question, I want to examine video game remakes, as they often do a great job in delivering a worthwhile product that actually justifies their existence. Unlike other media, video games require an array of very specific technology to experience. A book, for example, even if 50 years old, can still be opened and read all the same. Songs and movies, while they can be stored on outdated physical media in some cases, are widely available on different streaming services and digital storefronts today, where they can be easily accessed from basically any modern device. This isn't the case for video games, and when technology is as constantly evolving and fickle as it has been over the past decades, it can become a logistical challenge. Final Fantasy VII, for example, was initially released on the original PlayStation, which launched in the mid-90s, making it around 30 years old now. So for one, you'd have to find a working original PlayStation, along with all the necessary cables and accessories, such as working controllers. Additionally, the game and console were released before the advent of HDMI, so you'll either have to find a working CRT or spend even more money on adapters for your current TV. Lastly, of course, you'll need a copy of the game. Emulation is also an option, but users often need to jump through tons of hoops to get that up and running. It is a reliable solution, but one we'd be kidding ourselves if we said it was accessible to the majority of people. In cases like Final Fantasy VII in 2025, the effort and cost act as too great of a barrier to entry for most people. This is where remaking a game can help. With the Final Fantasy VII remakes, users can now access and experience the game with much less resistance. Simply buy the game on whatever platform you play your games on, and boom, you can now play that game with all the devices you already own. The likelihood of people experiencing that game has now increased exponentially thanks to the remake. There's something to be said about experiencing media in its original form. You can experience the history of the medium and appreciate influential and innovative traits that inspired what came after it. However, if we're being honest and realistic here, it can be a bit of a chore in practice. Here's what the original silent film Nosferatu looked like, for example. Yes, I have seen it, but I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed it. It was definitely a grueling hour and a half. Now, here's the 2024 remake of Nosferatu from Robert Eggers. If I were to recommend one of these to somebody who wanted to experience Nosferatu, I'm not recommending the original to anybody outside of the most hardcore film buffs. This is why when the original Final Fantasy VII looks and plays like this, it's unrealistic to expect a new generation of players to want to go out of their way to experience it. However, when it looks and plays like this, now we're talking. Now you have a product that not only looks better, but feels better to play, and is more likely to attract people to stick with it and experience the whole thing in the modern day, as well as simply having a less dated version of the product to exist. The merit of this goal, in particular, is open to much more contextual interpretation than the first two. This is where remakes often falter in the eyes of some, and it really just depends on the execution. Remakes usually aim to keep the core of the story and experience intact, while potentially adding certain elements to some areas. For example, maybe in the remake, they change some line delivery. Maybe they remove or shorten some sections that were a bit long in the tooth originally. Perhaps they update the art style. Maybe they even change the framework for the combat system in the game, like Final Fantasy VII did. Remakes don't aim to be the same as their original, they aim to change elements of it while keeping said core intact in an attempt to improve upon it, or add to it. Some people might like the results, some people might not. Maybe you like the old art style more. Maybe you prefer the old combat system. Maybe the changes they make to a character's story arc or design are actually praised by audiences. Maybe it's a positive change. The results of tweaking the original work can be inconsistent and divisive, but at least the potential for improvement and tasteful addition is there. They wouldn't change something they know they cannot improve upon. Maybe they do it in execution, maybe they don't, but they know the potential to do it is there. Because if it wasn't, what would be the reason for that? A company would have to be insane to ever make a remake if they knew they could not feasibly improve.
Oh my goodness!
In the context of live-action remakes, it's honestly okay if your remake reaches for even one of the goals I've laid out. If we look at the Disney live-action remakes that we've been getting, we can already rule out the goals of accessibility and technical modernization immediately. If the goal is accessibility, then signing up for 1 month of Disney Plus to watch the original Lilo and Stitch already has fewer barriers to entry. You can watch it at any time of day, rather than at set theater showtimes, and without having to leave the house. Additionally, a 1-month subscription is in all likelihood cheaper than tickets for you and the family, transportation, possibly parking, and food and drink at the theater. And once the remake joins the Disney Plus library, then it's equally as accessible anyways, so that isn't a factor either. Technical modernization you could make an argument for, I suppose, but when the original movie looks and sounds like this, I think that argument would be a bit of a stretch, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people that disagree with me. Therefore, a live-action remake's only hope for justifying its existence is the potential for improvement and tasteful addition, which in my humble opinion is the only one of these goals that is impossible in the context of 2D animation to live-action remakes. Let's take a look at this little clip from the original 2002 animation. I don't know about you, but I like this scene. I like it a lot, actually. I mean, it's funny, it's cute, puts you in a good mood as the movie ends. Although this scene was not included in the live-action remake, let's imagine how they'd theoretically accomplish it. Now, if you think they'd be able to convert the scene one for one, then think again. Tonally, it wouldn't fit a live-action setting at all. That lollipop is maybe 6 inches wide. A baby wouldn't be able to fit that entire thing in its mouth, short of the baby looking exceedingly cursed. Imagine how creepy Pennywise looks when he opens his mouth really wide when he goes to eat his victims. Additionally, babies don't really have reliable control of their motor functions yet, meaning the baby wouldn't be able to wave that precisely or decisively really. In order to have the scene play properly in a live-action setting, you'd have to rework it or rewrite it. Perhaps Stitch only has one of those small spherical lollipops to give to the baby, or if he does have one of those large disc-shaped ones, the baby would only be able to lick it. It may seem like I'm harping on such small little changes, but the devil is in the details with this kind of thing. If we take a step back and look at these scenes now, for example, one of them is much more charming, memorable, creative, imaginative, filled with character, and heart. This is the crux of the problem with live-action remakes. The surrealism and deviance from the plausible 2D animation allows for is precisely what must necessarily be lacking in live action. I want to interject here for a moment, so bear with me. I mentioned that replicating 2D animated scenes in live action wouldn't tonally fit at all, and I mentioned the need to rework or rewrite a scene if converting it to live action. But why is this the case? Well, allow me to explain. If you aren't familiar, this is called the uncanny valley. In essence, it's a principle that dictates you feel a sense of unease or discomfort when confronted with human-like things, but that are noticeably inhuman. Think of how a cartoon human isn't creepy, and a normal human isn't creepy, but animatronic humans can definitely be creepy, and the Michael Myers mask definitely is creepy. This occurs because, believe it or not, the human brain has an extraordinary ability to subconsciously recognize when things don't look quite right in the natural world. Look at these two apples, for instance. One is real and one is obviously cartoonish. But now look at these two apples. Now everybody should be able to correctly identify which one is fake and which one is real. But how? Is the lighting off? Is the stem a little too perfect? Something about the skin doesn't look quite right? Including myself, we can all clearly tell which apple is fake without knowing how we know. We just know. So now that we understand that, I want to change the graph to represent something different than the uncanny valley, but that utilizes the same graph function and the same principle. That we can tell when something isn't quite real, and if so, we cannot really connect with it. Not sure if such a graph exists already or not, but regardless, I'm making one. I call it the graph of suspension of disbelief. The x-axis can represent realism, and the y-axis can represent what we will call investment. Basically, the audience's belief in a story, emotional and mental investment into a story, the state of being bought into the story, however you want to put that. A 2D animated movie like Lilo and Stitch would fit somewhere here, a live-action movie about here. Now back to the crux of the problem I was mentioning earlier. The graph of suspension of disbelief is what will illustrate it. If you try to allow that same surrealism in a live-action setting that 2D animation employs, then you will fall into that valley, like the two wide-mouth baby hypothetical. You must avoid falling into that valley on the graph of suspension of disbelief in order for your audience to remain invested and bought into your story. You either need to tell your story through a clearly fake delivery method, such as 2D animation, or you need to go all the way to live action and completely rely on realism. In this case, within the context of a fictional story about an alien pretending to be a dog, but you know what I mean. In doing so, though, you completely sanitize any charm, heart, character, imagination, and creativity your animated story once had. In the live-action Lion King remake, for example, you can't have your realistic lions be quite as emotive or expressive, because real-life lions can't do that. That means every emotional scene, such as Mufasa's death, has significantly less emotional impact. Scar can't look as sinister as he did outside of his character design alone. Mufasa can't convey his desperate pleas to his brother with his face anymore. And Simba's agonizing, traumatic moment has to be expressed solely through his voice. It all just falls so flat. It's why the under the sea scene in The Little Mermaid leaves such an impression on you. All the creatures in the animation can be hyper-expressive, and they can use different sea objects as musical instruments, which is far more charming than live-action sea creatures just kind of moving around in a rhythmic way, which, like I illustrated, doesn't really sit right with me. Something about sea creatures moving like that sets off that subconscious alarm that we all have and pulls us out of the story. This is a perfect example of a live-action remake falling into that valley and why it's crucial, imperative, that it's avoided. And although no live-action scene of Stitch trading the lollipop to the baby exists, it's why it wouldn't be quite as funny or imaginative if it did. It's funny to see Stitch trading a lollipop to a baby for its bottle like they're intellectual equals. It's funny having the baby and Stitch both somehow fit the entirety of that massive lollipop in their mouths. If that scene was to be reworked to be realistic in live action, sure, a happy baby with a lollipop is cute for its own reason, but it wouldn't have the same distinctive charm that the animated classic has. By not aiming to present itself as realistic, these 2D animated classics don't have to concern themselves or be restricted by realism. In fact, they can lean into the surreal instead. This allows them to create moments that are wholly memorable, that leave a lasting impression on you, making them classics. The pertinent task of avoiding surrealism in live action exceeds just the movie's visuals though, and it must also affect how a movie is written, which is precisely why I claimed at the start of this video that Lilo and Stitch is uniquely positioned to serve as the cornerstone example of why a live action remake cannot surpass its original. A plot that relies heavily on aliens pretending to be of a species they're not doesn't lend itself to realistic conversion at all. It's why in the live-action remake, Jumba and Pleakley are just normal dudes most of the time. In 2D animation, since we recognize it's not real, they were able to lean into the surreal, and we could still buy into them disguising as human tourists. It doesn't set off our subconscious disbelief alarm the way it would in live action. In live-action settings we subconsciously see as real, you cannot convince us that these things could blend in as tourists. It simply wouldn't work, and it caused them to make this change, which also contributes to the mentioned visual downgrades in regards to the movie's charm, creativity, heart, etc. Look at these two shots. Jumba and Pleakley are blending in to observe Stitch interacting with Lilo and Nani in both of them. And I dare you to sit there and tell anybody that the live-action one is even close to as interesting as the animated one. It just looks so vanilla, so bland. Furthermore, the director claimed, rightly so, that they couldn't get Gontu to work properly in a live-action setting.
Gontu was one of those things that, it just didn't work so well in live action. We explored it a bit, but ultimately we had to make the decision. And also, I do stand by the decision because I feel like a lot of the things that in trying to ground these characters more and tell a story with a little more emotional depth.
Uh-oh, now the movie doesn't have a main villain or antagonistic force for the climax anymore, causing more changes to be necessary in the rewrite. Now, in the remake, Jumba has to be the villain. His redemption arc has been removed, which ends up detracting from the familial themes of the movie. This is just one example of how the need for mainly visual-driven rewrites can have effects run deeper than just the visuals, and how it can affect the thematic presence of the movie. I hope I've clearly illustrated here why converting a 2D animated story into live action isn't a trivial task of simply filming it and putting it out there beat for beat. The main conceits that many of these classics rely on in animated form simply are not feasible in a live-action setting. Their visual changes can have ramifications reaching far past simply a more bland-looking image, but it can remove emotional impact, memorability, and the overall impression it can leave on you. It can mandate reapproaching certain aspects of these classics to make them even functional in live action. But if you change core elements of a classic, then you're changing what about it was classic. To be clear, though, surrealism isn't something that is impossible in live action. Look at the Sonic movies. Sonic is a highly expressive digital character that fits in perfectly in a live action setting. It works because although he's a hedgehog, I mean, look at him, that's not a hedgehog, you guys, let's just be real. His surreal look prevents our subconscious "that's not real" alarms from going off. Next, look at a movie like The Blues Brothers. That movie overtly defies possibly every law of physics at every opportunity. But the movie is consistent in its tone and doesn't ever pretend to be a grounded story. So bending those laws in a movie as absurd as this doesn't bother you. In fact, it actually uses that knowledge of how the world works to subvert your expectations as an approach to its comedy. The movie drives a car off of a bridge, and then it winds up somehow thousands of feet in the air. The movie looks you dead in the eyes and says, "We know this doesn't make sense. So what? Deal with it."
You want out of this parking lot? Okay.
Would there be anything else?
Yes, do you have a Miss Piggy?
When you aren't creating an original story, though, and you're adapting an originally 2D animated movie, you don't get to make any of these creative tonal choices, really. You can't dramatically change the tone of the movie to allow for a more surreal feel, akin to the Blues Brothers, because that would serve to alienate the fans of the original and detract from the nature of the movie being a safe bet to make a lot of money that I keep talking about. Sonic works as a series because those are their own original stories. You're able to approach writing a plot in which clearly surreal characters can coexist in a live-action setting because that is being considered from the point of ideation. Such stories that make these considerations in their earliest creative stages avoid pitfalls of having to change elements of themselves to work in a live-action framework, such as in Lilo and Stitch. All of this before even mentioning how the attempts at tasteful addition in these Disney remakes have been consistently misguided so far. So what's the point then? We established that in the modern day, animated classics are as accessible as they've ever been, and they were created during a time when they could utilize the most crucial technological filmmaking advancements, ensuring that they've aged fairly gracefully. So why are we making these? For one final time, we're ignoring the making a lot of money on a safe bet answer. The only hope of live-action remakes justifying their existence is the hope to improve upon the originals, to create a product that can be more greatly enjoyed by the next generation. But that just can't happen with these. It can't happen because you can't improve on the charm, character, imagination, or the creativity when you actively need to strip back on the logical concessions providing those qualities when you convert them into live action. You may be saying that it isn't a big deal that those logical concessions can't be made anymore. You may be thinking that I'm making a massive video essay version of a rant on minute details. You may be thinking that whether it's surreal or not, it's still the story you fell in love with, and yeah, you're right. Theoretically, changing the lollipop in that scene from a 6-inch disc one to a round spherical one doesn't change the story of Lilo and Stitch. Changing Jumba and Pleakley from aliens into humans most of the time doesn't alone materially change how the story plays out. It most certainly is just minutia that I'm digging into here. It's all small details for the most part that I'm harping on about. But like I said before, the devil is in the details. Changing that lollipop scene might not make it bad, but I'd argue it's even just a slightly worse version of the original, at the very least. Having Pleakley and Jumba front as humans doesn't alone materially change the journey they go on in following and observing Stitch, but again, I'd argue it's a worse version of it on account of it being less visually interesting and distinctive. This main dilemma regarding logical concessions with adapting 2D animation to live action underpins the entire approach to making these things, and the dichotomy of the real versus the surreal absolutely defines them. The contextually realistic approach that live action mandates, in my opinion, makes every aspect of live action remakes effectively worse. Maybe by a lot, maybe only by a little, but all of it must ultimately and fundamentally be worse in order to function.